Welcome to MedTech Speed to Data, a KeyTech podcast. I'm your host, Andy Rogers, VP of Business Development at KeyTech. Each month, me and a KeyTecher are going to interview a MedTech leader and talk to them about the critical data-driven decisions they make in their programs. Hey everybody, welcome back to MedTech Speed to Data. I'm your host, Andy Rogers, back again. Today, our episode, we have Neal Piper, founder and CEO of Luminoah. Neal, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Andy.
All right. So Neal, for our audience, our audience of entrepreneurs developing med devices and life science tools and global companies, just give us a little bit of background on who you are and where the idea for Luminoah came from.
Thanks, Andy. My name's Neal Piper. I'm founder and CEO of Luminoah, which is a MedTech medical device company based in Charlottesville, Virginia, just outside of DC, about 2 hours southwest of DC for your international listeners. We're developing a new way of tube feeding for people that can't eat and drink by mouth. My background, I've spent over 15 years in healthcare, primarily commercializing pharmaceuticals and medical devices here in the US and about 18 countries around the world. Much of that time was at Pfizer Pharmaceuticals and then later Population Services International. Moved to Charlottesville from DC about 10 years ago for another startup, and then started Luminoah in 2020. And at that time, I wasn't looking to start a new company. It came out of a personal need for my wife and I. We have twins, Safi and Noah. When my son Noah turned 3 years old, he started choking on his saliva and his food. Went in for an MRI and found out that he had a tumor in the jugular foramen in the base of his skull. And so he was getting pressure on his nerves through his vocal cords. And that was what was causing him to have an inability to eat and drink by mouth. And so we spent, about 10 days at UVA in the PICU. He was in a medical coma. It was, the hardest part of our life. Being a research hospital, we were greeted with about 30 providers in the hallway of thinking about the treatment plan of how are we going to keep your son alive. And fortunately for us, we had a really positive outcome. Later got him out of that coma. We're able to get a chemotherapy that was able to target the type of cancer that he had. After 18 months, he rang the bell signaling the end of his therapy at UVA Children's Hospital. And so while he was getting therapy, he was sleeping, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, getting chemo. And, I couldn't quit thinking about the solution that came home with us for enteral nutrition. Enteral nutrition, or tube feeding, it's called. You typically come home with an NG tube through your nose that pumps food right to your stomach. And then later, if you're using that long term over 30 days, you get a gastronomy button in your stomach and you're fed directly to your stomach. Imagine like the end of a beach ball that you blow up, the cap. That's what the access port looks like. But then you come home with the current standard of care, which is an IV pole, peristaltic pump, a bag you replace every 24 hours to prevent from bacteria buildup. And depending on the calories you need and the flow rate, you're tethered to this device with about 2 meters of tubing upwards of 24 hours a day. For us, we're attached to a pole 8 hours a day during the day, plus overnight feeds. Noah, tripped over his tubing once, ended up back in the hospital, almost pulled out his gastronomy button. And, there's handwritten logs. It's a life-sustaining device that helps patients who have over 300 disease states globally, an $11 billion market with 500,000 new patients in the US alone. And so this is a major challenge that patients are dealing with, a lack of portability, a lack of an intuitive approach, and without being able to track that data and be empowered with data. So while Noah was undergoing chemo, started researching and really leveraging the experience I had at Pfizer, studying clinical trials and studies and reaching out to thought leaders and providers and patients to better understand the need, because we didn't want to assume that every kid was like Noah's use case or like our family background. And so we really wanted to broaden that, and ultimately learned with some support from our local ecosystem, Civo BioHub, and an investor friend of mine that, we had a real opportunity to make a difference. And the whole premise of starting this was not to create a profitable company. It was really driven because we saw a lot of kids with this need and figured, when life's out of your control, try to find the controllables. And this was it. And really leaned into that. When Noah rang the bell at UVA, there was a rocket ship. And we talked a lot about space. So I merged illumination, the measure of light, with Noah's name, Luminoah, to create a brighter future for people like him and, kids and adults to create a better, brighter future for tube feeding.
That's such a great story, Neil. And we were talking before we started recording about, just another personal story. And sometimes that's what it takes to really like get things going, just the passion to change, treatment and to just make it better for those patients that are in need. For our audience, can you just describe why enteral feeding is needed? I mean, I know your son was on chemotherapy and, his story, but maybe more broadly to, why are enteral feeding tubes and pumps needed?
Yeah, so it's primarily driven through three areas. About 25% of the market are oncology patients that just can't, their ability to eat or just their appetite is suppressed. So they need supplemental nutrition through tube feeding. You have a whole wide array of motility disorders or GI disorders that could require someone to need enteral nutrition. They're not able to process food in their gut or break it down in the digestive tract. And that's about 20 to 25% of the market, followed by neurological disorders, stroke, Alzheimer's, other neurological disorders. And it really hits home to a broad patient population from newborns to, end of life for a geriatric patient. And so for us, we really want to be able to improve the lives of a broad audience of individuals that would need this device, and specifically up front in the home setting, because we feel that
Sure.
with improvement of quality care and value-based care in the home is the future. And we want to be able to live, patients to live more of a active and as normal a life as possible.
Got it. So the anatomy of these enteral feeding pumps are, the reservoir of the nutrients, some consumable connected to a pumping mechanism, whether it's on a pole or on the body, and then some way of, exhausting that reservoir into the human body. Is that at a high level what the architecture is of these products?
Yeah, absolutely right. It's a peristaltic pump that is attached to a pole. You have a daily consumable, a nutrition reservoir that you hang above. It's gravity fed into that pump. And then you have a whole array of formulas like Nestle and Kate Farms and Real Blends that people use to pour into that pouch, and then you prime the pump for about 3.5 minutes attached to your stomach or NG tube. Press start, and then let's say if you're 1,000 calorie a day, individual, or that's your need, 1 ml per calorie. So you need 1,000 ml nutrition, and if your flow rate is at 60 ml an hour, you can see how that then turns into a long period of time that you're sitting and waiting for that food to pump to your stomach.
You described a little bit about your son tripping over the tubing, and I can imagine just carting a pole around, as a healthy or, a disabled adult being challenging, let alone a toddler. What were some of the fallacies with the current design that your product, the Enlumen, is looking to overcome?
For us, is the design is bulky. It's not built for being a portable device. It feels more like a IV infusion pump that is a larger device built for a hospital setting with loud alarms, and it looks like a hospital device. And so when you walk into someone's home,
Right.
you see a person for a medical condition, not for the incredible contributions that they can contribute to the world. And so one, it's bulky. Two, it needs to be gravity fed to be able to deliver nutrition. And then there's, a long tubing set of about 2 meters that you have to pump all that nutrition and air out of that tubing. The other issue was just no data tracking. So, you've got a life-sustaining device, and you've got nurses in and out of the house, different caregivers, and you're tired, you're sleepy, you're doing the best you can to help as a caregiver, or to take care of yourself, even with other treatments that you have going on. And you forget when you last gave a feed. And malnutrition represents over a $50 billion burden in the health system in the US. Many patients end up readmitted because their body weight drops, which, imagine now a patient who has cancer, is immunocompromised, now is being readmitted and they're malnourished. And so those are really the three major problems that we set out to solve, and where there's gaps in the current technology. It's just been decades since we've seen any real innovation in this space.
Yeah, why do you think that is? I mean, because we are seeing here at KeyTech quite a bit of work in large volume subcutaneous at home, body worn devices. You see, Becton Dickinson launches these, West Pharmaceutical launches them, other patch pumps, right? They're out there. Why is enteral feeding lagging, do you think?
I think part of it is potentially because of reimbursement. In addition, some of the big players in the space, this is one component of many devices that they have. That's part of the issue. We were just recently at the Oli Foundation Summit in St. Louis, which brings together industry and patients and companies and clinicians together. Patients have been sharing with companies their needs and what needs to be changed, and their feelings were that they don't feel like companies have been listening to date. And so I think in some spaces, if it's not broke, don't fix it as well. And it was interesting for us as a caregiver coming home with a son that needed this technology. We were extremely grateful that we had a technology to keep him alive, and it did exactly that. And I think there's times, and you probably see this time and time again, as mentioned, Andy, with founders that you find on the show, is that sometimes it takes a user or someone experiencing a pain point personally to really drive that innovation and to have that passion to go through the grind of a startup and all that it entails to get that to push forward. And I think that's certainly the case in the enteral nutrition space.
So tell us a little bit. It's 3 years now, 3 years on since 2020 when you had the idea to start this company, I would imagine, or when your son was going through treatment. So just for our audience, can you tell us where you are in development and just maybe a little bit about the product itself?
We started March of 2020, about 3.5 years in, and we're about a month away from design freeze. So we've got a working
awesome
device, and imagine a click and go solution, something that's smaller than an iPhone in terms of height and width, and that just clicks on your waist, and you click in a new nutrition reservoir that can pump regardless of orientation. Our hope now is that a kid could go to school without being homeschooled. Currently, a lot of states require a skilled nurse for a child to have enteral nutrition at school, for a loved one to be empowered with data and know what are trends to prevent some of that readmission to the hospital due to malnutrition. So we're creating a portable, intuitive, connected device. We're submitting to the FDA with the aim of doing that later this year for a 510(k) approval, with clearance anticipated in 2024.
Yeah, that's really exciting. From experience, I know developing infusion pumps is incredibly challenging from a regulatory perspective. Now that's infusing, I guess drugs, not enteral feeding. So at a high level, what are the differences between, the regulatory requirements for an enteral feeding pump compared to, say, an infusion pump that's administering anesthesia, for example?
There's very clear guidance from the FDA on infusion pumps, and we've worked with many regulatory consultants over the years to kind of pressure test and validate our pathway. And so we've got a lot of the standards that need to be moved forward with our quality system and for that submission. And one thing that's unique is just the variances of plus or minus a certain amount of variance of viscosity of material that's going into the body, and that the pump is pumping that at the rate stated within that variance. but it's, there are some different standards between like an IV infusion, which is going into, the blood versus a standard of an infusion pump, directly feeding to the gut.
Maybe less stringent volumetric accuracy requirements, and on the alarm side, maybe a little bit less there. All right, before we get into the crux of this discussion, speed to data, we'll talk about the data, and for our audience, just what were you trying to do early on, and kind of, again, where you are now, what data is critical for you. Can you just describe a little bit about how you've gotten to where you are? What does your team look like? What funding sources have you tapped? Just, in 3 years, you're knocking on FDA's door with a pump design. That's really hard to do. So just describe maybe that high level story a little bit for our audience.
Well, we did get a lot of sleep along the way, and
well, don't forget about the pandemic. You had a pandemic to navigate as well. That couldn't have been easy.
That's right. And so, Luminoah was just essentially an idea, and was very fortunate. A close friend of mine who is part of a family office, when sharing the idea, really first talked about the market. What does the market look like? Where's the opportunity? Because if you can't raise capital around an idea in a market size, then it's going to be very difficult to get your innovation in the market. So I was really grateful for that support, followed by, being in a community with an ecosystem that really supports the life sciences community. For us, we have Sivo BioHub, someone I was, already friends with. Nikki Hastings runs the Sivo BioHub in Charlottesville, which brings together our life sciences community. And, just before the pandemic, she invited me to an event that the FDA was presenting at. I was the CEO of another company at the time, and people started asking me why I'm there. And, I said, well, I'm thinking of starting this medical device company. Well, why? Well, my son is getting chemo at UVA, and we have this device idea. I think it could be better. And they're like, well, you should do it. Why don't you just start something? And it was kind of the wind behind the sails of saying, because we all have ideas that pass our head all the time of how we can solve problems in the world, but to move forward with that is pretty rare, right? And so it was thanks to those people in my life that said you should do something about this, that I actually did. And then, the pandemic hit, everything closed down, and then was connected with the UVA biomedical engineering master's program through Jonathan Rosen. We said, well, Sivo BioHub and UVA have this internship program. All the biomedical engineering master's students lost their internships, and we were fortunate to hire 3 of those folks who were really talented and, weren't able to work for big companies. They started working for this startup no one's heard of. One of those folks, Hill Johnson, is now our senior product lead. He's been with the company since the beginning. And so I personally invested the first year, and then we raised about $1 million in seed funding on a convertible note with Sands Capital and Prize Path Capital. We had some really good angel investors in that round as well. Our plan then was to really pressure test what we call the 5 Ps, which, your product, validating, can you build this? Can you solve the problems around that innovation, and like build designs? We went through, dozens of interviews of providers and patients and hospital administrators from, very different backgrounds and experiences to, what's your plan? What's your go-to-market strategy? What's the financial model look like? And, what's your patent strategy? Can you protect this? So we put in over 8 patents to date, and brought in a really good firm. And then who are your people that, because your team is only as good as the people that you have. And then what's your pathway? So really pressure testing those 5 Ps. And then once doing so, we launched the race for a Series A and closed that on a $6 million round on June 14th of this year.
You kind of bootstrapped your way through almost most of the product development. If just a year or a month ago, you raised your Series A, which I assume is to start scaling up and getting through other trials and things like that you might need to do. Lots of questions from that. I guess first comment is, it takes a village, right? It sounds like, Charlottesville's a great ecosystem of, successful entrepreneurs and just people that are willing to kind of, provoke you into just jumping off that cliff and figuring out how to fly. So congrats on making that big step. I know it's challenging. Second, we did our homework for this interview. I looked at the patents. We've invented, body-worn infusion pumps before as well, or brainstormed them. I know it's a very crowded landscape, just infusion in general. So, but I imagine that your therapeutic area, being kind of late to this innovation was your sort of backdoor to securing a lot of those patents, which is a marvelous story. I know we don't need to get into the details of all of that, but I know that that's a key part, particularly in infusion, getting around patent blocks. Early on in development, then, what data was most critical for you? You mentioned the 5 Ps. I really want to hone in on, like, you can throw billions or millions out there of, in enteral feeding tube patients and, point to stepping on a tube and showing that it's clunky. And you could interview 5 people and they'll tell you it's clunky. Like, it doesn't take much to kind of get to that. So aside from like those simple things, was there any other like data that you really needed to convince yourself to proceed with this? Like, what was it really, do you think was like the point where you're like, I'm doing this?
It was being at UVA hospital and seeing other kids walking around with a similar technology.
Interesting.
And it completely ripped out my heart in a way that was just unimaginable, right? As my first time, spending significant time in a children's hospital with very sick kids and realizing that we weren't alone. We had enough of a strong amount of pain points that we knew there was a major problem to solve, but that wasn't enough to then put significant investment into it. I mean, it was enough to, hire some interns and to start doing a research project. But before we raised real capital, we really wanted to pressure test our assumptions. Part of my career, I worked in global healthcare, kind of market access and infrastructure development, and countries all around the world, Somalia and Nigeria, Nepal and India and all over. And what I learned in that experience coming from a big pharmaceutical company going into a different market is you don't have the answers when you come in. You think you do,
Sure.
but unless you listen to a lot of people and take those inputs and not assume your experience is the experience of representative of others, you really don't know if you're solving the right problem. And so, everyone says don't obsess about the solution, obsess about the problem. And that's what we did. And so after many, many, many interviews with, GI surgeons to, GI providers to nutritionists to the CEO of distributors that sell this, distribute this device to many patients from different backgrounds and experiences and ages. It was time and time again, the 3 main issues. We need something that's, more discreet and portable, something that's easier to use, and something that enables us to be in control of our own data and be more independent. And we have a young person in our user group who developed a GI disorder later in life, who recently had to step away from work as a result of her feeding tube, who's a very talented engineer. It was the same use cases, same stories as a result of being diagnosed, whether at an early age or a late age of a disease. We want those folks to live, the best quality of life as possible and keep them out of the hospital and the home. And so it was that reoccurring theme that really reinforced that we've got a real opportunity to solve an unmet need for a lot of people.
It sounds like just getting those interviews done across the ecosystem, as you said, distributors all the way through to the other children like your son who are dealing with this problem. You mentioned control of your own data. What does that mean?
So being able to know if you're getting inputs of calories, of how many calories a day are you getting? We've got a huge data opportunity to empower patients with their own data to provide better outcomes of their care and to reduce the readmission that we're seeing in the healthcare system as a result of malnutrition related to tube feeding.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole point, right? Is keeping yourself nourished and out of the hospital. So I imagine tracking calories in. And are you considering linking to smart watches or sort of activity, caloric spend sort of closed loop sort of control in a way?
Absolutely.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
You don't have to go into that detail. So early days, lots of surveys, lots of interviews. Fast forward to today. Now you're on the doorstep of FDA. Like what data is most critical for you to collect here over these next couple of months? Is it just good old fashioned verification, validation data, and proving that the design is reliable at scale, that kind of thing?
That's exactly right, Andy. And so that's where we're scaling up the team as we speak. And we have over 12 contributors in the company now. Just recently brought in a new chief operating officer who's got 28 510K clearances,
Wow.
and it's been in this business for a long time. And we've got a new opening for a senior quality engineer, a quality assurance engineer, and then also hiring several hardware engineers at the moment as well. So really building out in-house talent, in addition bringing in other external partners to support us. As you know, it takes time to hire really good talent. We take our time when we bring people in, because a company is only as good as its people. You can
Mm-hmm.
have a great idea, but without good execution and good experienced people, then you won't get your product to market. We're bringing in external contractors and hiring at the moment.
Right. Where are you making this product? Like in-house, or are you using a contract manufacturing sort of model?
Right now, we're in-house on the device, and then once we scale units, we'll bring in a contract manufacturer, and then we've got a daily disposable giving set that we're working with an external contract manufacturer.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, it sounds like you are off to the races, and that COO hire, I'm sure, takes a lot of the burden off of you these days to free you up to think maybe bigger picture and make sure you're hitting the right product market fit, which is a good segue to the last section here of this podcast. We haven't talked about this directly, but it's a question. This enteral pump design is, I assume, designed for 3-year-olds and 90-year-olds, right? So how did you accommodate that range of use cases and user needs? It's a pretty broad range.
Yeah, it's a really broad range. The predicate device is indicated for age 2 to geriatric, and we're targeting a similar 510K clearance. In the beginning, it was friends who we knew. When you're in the cancer community or you have a tube-fed child, you get to know other people in the community, and so we interviewed other parents with kids, and then we joined Oli Foundation, which I might have mentioned earlier, brings together industry and patients, and
I'm sorry, what is this foundation, Neal?
it's the Oli Foundation, and we were just in St. Louis with them 2 weeks ago exhibiting. They bring about 500 patients together every year for a big summit who are tube-fed, but they've got over 28,000 members of tube-fed patients, and bring together clinicians and industry. And so we were able to really tap into that as well to find some patients that wanted to provide inputs on our design. We had one gentleman who I believe was 86 years old, who contributed as a user in that. Talked to some folks from long-term care facilities who are overseeing care for elderly patients. Had quite a number of parents with children who are tube-fed, and then some young professionals in their mid-20s who are trying to work every day while using this technology. And so the pandemic actually was played to our advantage in that way. First getting that early talent of interns that normally we might not be able to afford or get from the big companies and attract them, to then patients, providers, and administrators who were working remote for the first time and out of the hospital setting, that we had access to in a way that we might not have if we started a company today.
Yeah, that Oli Foundation. I have to look that up. It seems like a great environment to test your hypotheses, whatever that is, on an annual basis, right? Shift from exploration to sort of validation of your product.
It was incredible. We that was the first time we've exhibited at a conference. We spoke at JP Morgan earlier this year, and we were in stealth mode at that point. But it was us and every major person in the sector that was exhibiting, and we had a book called Super Tubi book that we read to our son and made a big impact on him, which is a story of three kids that use their Tubi for superpowers. And I reached out to the author in advance and see if I could buy some books to give away to kids while we're there, because it really resonated with our family. And she's like, I'm only 4.5 hours from St. Louis. I'll drive and I'll sign it and do a reading. So she came and we gave away books to all the kids there and did a reading. And it was really powerful because it was the first time she had read the book, which she wrote for her son, who needed a Tubi as well, where you've got, over 25 kids that have this need, and they start connecting the dots that I'm not just a kid with a tube with a medical illness, I have a superpower. And it was really emotional week to be there and get so much validation that we're on the right path.
Yep. Before we logged on here, you were talking about your favorite podcast, aside from MedTech Speed to Data, about how I built this. And so you've shared your how you built this story, but we were also going to talk about grit. And, for our audience, that's what it takes to navigate the unknown. And you've got competition at every corner, but you also need to be open to to every change to your product anatomy, depending on what you're learning from these interviews and whatnot. So can you just describe maybe some challenges you've had being an entrepreneur here over the last few years, where grit, helped you get through it? Like, how did you get through these challenges?
I think you need grit every single day. In our restroom, just right around the corner, there's a poster. It says, it's got a straight line going up, and it says, this is what everyone thinks success looks like. It's kind of that vertical line. And it's the swiggly one that we've all seen as entrepreneurs. It's like, this is what success actually looks like. And it is a grind. For us, there was a lot of pain points along the way. I think raising capital and in the environment we're in now, with the macroeconomic environment, where, in the January of 2022, where we saw a big drop in IPOs and valuation and pre-revenue companies. I mean, that was when we were launching a Series A. And so, it took much longer than expected. We were really fortunate to partner with several children's hospitals that had non-diluted grants to get us through some of those times. And also Virginia has a commercial fund with Virginia Innovation, Partners Corporation, VIPSI. City of Charlottesville supported us. I mean, we were really fortunate to be able to use grit in challenging economic times to find, non-diluted ways to keep the company moving forward as the process to find Series A leads and investors, unfolded. A lot of people say, they expect 3 to 6 months for a close. In an environment like this, it took a lot of grit to say, well, that's not realistic given this macroeconomic environment. And so it took a lot of grit, and really making sure that you're maximizing every dollar spent, that if you spend $1, it should return $1 to $10 in value, because you really need to maximize every dollar to move the process forward. But I think every day takes grit. There's hard things along the way. You got to be able to say the things you don't think you can say. And whether it's a hard decision, a difficult conversation with a team member, or just about timelines, and making sure everyone's rowing downstream together. I think that's really critical.
Yeah, and as you say, you need it every day. And in my experience developing products as a design engineer and project manager, you're getting into the challenging part, like verification and validation, design freeze. And if the design has to work, and if it's not working reliably or to spec, then what are the improvements you can make, and to what extent should you make those changes just to get on the market, knowing that you're going to have to make more extensive changes later? Or do you kind of bite the bullet and make those bigger changes before you go to market? All those, like I have my kids are 12 and 11 and 7. So medium kid, medium problems, like you're at that
That's
point as a
right.
company where you're in medium company, medium problems now, which is a great place to be. I mean, you've done so well so far. I'm sure you'll be fine getting through it. And engineering problems for the most part can be solved. It's product market fit you want to get right. It sounds like you've nailed that, Neal. So congrats.
That's right. I think Andy, to your point, is like that's where experience really comes to play, where
Mm-hmm.
people who have had the scars and they have a lot of scars from mistakes and experience and grew from that on your team, and making sure you've got good coaches on the team and good players, right? And that had 10, 20, 30 years experience, that if and you get into that process, if something does come up, you know how to solve it and to fix it and make those decisions, so that you do have a product that safe, effective for patients and meets the needs of patients, and that has that product market fit. And we feel really fortunate to have good people surrounding us in the company.
Yeah. One last comment on developing these pumps. Our go-to-market strategy here at KeyTech for infusion pumps is you have to develop a model of the system first, like a first principles model, so that when you're at the end of the development and you're not getting the accuracy you want, or you want to make improvements, you have this kind of system and this model of the system that you can change your parameters and understand how it will affect the performance at the system level. So is that something that you've done when, in designing this thing from scratch, like a first principles model of the system, so that if you do get into verification, you have to change design, you kind of know where to look?
Yeah, we have. We've
That's
got
great.
all the user requirements, the trace matrix, the harms and hazards, and all the requirements in the FDA from predicate devices of the needs, and we have clear sight of what's required and what is needed for once we get into the testing and validation.
Got it. Awesome. Well, Neal, hey, thank you so much for sharing your story here on this episode of MedTech Speed to Data. So thanks again for coming on.
Thank you, Andy. It's really good to be here with you. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, just shoot me a LinkedIn. And we got so much value out of podcasts like yours, along the way. And we're here to support other entrepreneurs in the ecosystem. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right, Neal. Thanks again. Until next time, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to MedTech Speed to Data, a KeyTech podcast. Join us each month for more ways to get the right data faster to inform critical decisions. Find additional resources on our website, keytechinc.com. If you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe, and please leave a review on iTunes whenever you listen. Thanks.